All rise, veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honors. This is the situation in the Republic of Mali in the case of the prosecutor versus Hassan Abdulaziz Mohammed Mahmoud. Case reference ICC 0112, 0118, and for the record, we are in open session.
Oh, sorry. Let me start that again. Good morning to everyone, including those in the courtroom, the public gallery, and those following online. The Chamber acknowledges the present situation in Mali and sends its condolences to the victims of the recent attacks. I'll begin by asking for the appearances, please, from the parties and participants. We'll start with the legal representatives of victims.
Bonjour, excellente Madame la juge-présidente. Bonjour, excellent Monsieur le juge et Madame le juge. Bonjour, chers collègues. L'équipe de la représentation légale des victimes dans cette affaire est représentée à cette audience par Maître Gilly Goffin, par Madame Anouk Kermiche, par Madame Priske Dipanga Biyeke, qui sont ici présents dans la salle d'audience. Et sur le terrain, il y a Maître Sédou Doumbia et l'assistant de terrain Boubacar Maïga et Janine Kapinga qui nous suivent depuis Bamako. Et Maître Mayombo Kassongo suit l'audience et interviendra, si possible, à partir de Kinshasa. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Now hear from the Office of Public Counsel for Victims.
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone present in the courtroom. The Office of Public Counsel for Victims is represented by Adeline Bedoucha and myself, Dmitro Supron. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Defense Counsel for Mr. Al-Hassan.
Bonjour Madame la Présidente, honorable juge, chers collègues. L'équipe Monsieur Al-Hassan est représentée ce matin par Madame Lili Zanjani, Monsieur Ibrahim Ag Mohamed et par moi-même, Mélissa Beaulieu-Lucier. Et Monsieur Al-Hassan est présent dans la salle ce matin. Merci.
Thank you very much. I turn now to the Office of the Prosecutor.
Bonjour Madame la Présidente, bonjour Madame la Juge, bonjour Monsieur le Juge. Le bureau du procureur est représenté ce matin par mes collègues Paola Saki à ma droite et Moussa Lafi immédiatement à ma droite, ainsi que moi-même Gilles Dutertre. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Duterte. And now the representatives of the registry, please.
Good morning, Madam President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, colleagues. This is Philip Ambach for the VPRS Victim Participation Reparations section of the registry.
Good morning, Your Honor. Good morning, Your Honors. Matthias Hellman for the Public Information and Outreach Section.
Thank you very much. And then the Trust Fund for Victims, please.
Good morning, Madam President, dear Excellencies, Your Honors. The Trust Fund for Victims is represented today by Franziska Eckelmans, Odd Legoff, Nicole Richter, Marcelo Martoy, Malina Witzenrath, and myself, Deborah Ruiz-Verduzco, Executive Director. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That concludes the appearances, I believe. Today, Trial Chamber 10 pronounces the reparations order in this case and delivers a public summary of its main findings and conclusions in accordance with the rules of procedure and evidence. The written reparations order has been issued and will be notified shortly after the conclusion of today's hearing. It is the only authoritative document and will be publicly available on the ICC website. The Chamber recalls that the crimes for which Mr. Al-Hassan was convicted were committed in the context of and in association with a non-international armed conflict in northern Mali. Through the period of the charges, which spanned from April 2012 to January 2013, Ansar Dine exercised control over the city of Timbuktu and conducted a systematic attack against the civilian population and imposing its interpretation of Sharia on the residents. Mr. Al-Hassan's responsibility for these crimes arises primarily out of his role within the Islamic police and the role of the Islamic police in the repressive system created by Ansar Dine. The Chamber recalls that Mr. Al-Hassan, who was a senior member of the Islamic police, was found guilty of 3 counts of crimes against humanity and 5 counts of war crimes, namely persecution on religious grounds, torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, and passing of sentences without previous judgment pronounced by a regularly constituted court affording all judicial guarantees. The Chamber adopts the consistent jurisprudence of the court on the principles on reparations to the extent that they are applicable on the particular facts of this case. As determined by the Appeals Chamber, a reparations order must contain at a minimum 5 essential elements. The Chamber will hereafter detail its findings with reference to those elements, namely personal liability, victims, harm, types and modalities, and amount of liability. I begin with personal liability. The Chamber notes that Mr. Al-Hassan, having been found responsible for the crimes which caused harm to the victims, as defined in the order, bears the financial liability for the cost of repairing the harm. In relation to the complementary nature of reparations and the no overcompensation principle, the Chamber finds that the harm remedied in the context of the reparations implemented in the Al-Mahdi case, which arose from the same conflict, is distinct from the harm caused by Mr. Al-Hassan's crimes. Turning then to victims, for the crime of persecution, the Chamber finds that all members of the population of the city of Timbuktu were the target of the crime of persecution on religious grounds. Given that the various types of harm arising from this crime affected the entirety of the local population, the Chamber finds it appropriate to presume the victimhood of any person who can demonstrate to the required standard of proof their presence or residence in the city of Timbuktu during the temporal scope of the case. As for individuals who fled the city prior to the arrival of Ansar Dine Hakim, or current members of the community who were not present at the moment of the commission of the crimes, including persons born after the temporal scope of the crime, the Chamber does not consider those persons as direct victims, since they did not suffer personal harm directly as a result of the persecution perpetrated by Ansar Dine Hakim and Mr. Al-Hassan. Regarding the direct victims of the crimes of torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, outrages on personal dignity, and sentencing without due process, the Chamber recalls that in this case, the confirmed charges adjudicated upon by the Chamber through the trial proceedings related to particular incidents with specified victims. Thus, the trial judgment and sentencing decision made findings with respect to the charges involving a limited number of individuals, which were not expansive or open-ended in the description of the victim population. For this reason, the Chamber finds that the direct victims of Mr. Al-Hassan's conviction for these particular crimes were the 49 persons as set out in the trial judgment and sentencing decision. The Chamber understands that many participating victims and others yet to be identified as victims of persecution may have experienced similar facts and harm to the specified victims. Nevertheless, the Chamber must not expand the scope of Mr. Al-Hassan's conviction. However, the Chamber notes that since the persecutory measures imposed by Ansar Dine Hakim included arrests, detentions, and the imposition of physical punishments, such harm is also recognized as arising from the persecution of the members of the population of the city of Timbuktu, and is thereby addressed in the reparations order in that context. Regarding indirect victims, following the court's jurisprudence, the Chamber finds that any individual who has suffered harm as a result of the harm experienced by the direct victims may be an indirect victim of the crimes, provided that they can demonstrate their own personal harm and causal link with the crimes to the required standard of proof. I turn now to the harm. In its order, the Chamber provides definitions for physical, moral, material, and community harm. Regarding the harm suffered by direct victims of persecution, the Chamber notes that Ansar Dine Hakim's rules and prohibitions were imposed through the implementation of a system of surveillance and punishment which relied on acts of violence, force, intimidation, and threat. Persons identified as having contravened the rules and prohibitions were punished directly or brought to the Islamic Police headquarters, where they were detained under dire conditions and eventually sentenced by the Islamic court and subjected to punishments including imprisonment and floggings. As determined in the judgment, it is clear that Ansar Dine Hakim's rules and prohibitions, as well as the associated punishments, were imposed on the population of Timbuktu as a whole, and thus the Chamber also finds that aside from the 14 direct victims whose harm was recognized in the trial judgment as amounting to torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity, there may be similarly situated victims who also suffered physical harm in the context of the crime of persecution. The Chamber also makes findings as to the following kinds of moral harm associated with the crime of persecution: the imposition of a system of repression that instilled fear in the population. This was particularly acute for women and girls. The Chamber notes that during the trial, numerous female victims testified to the fear they had of leaving their homes, believing that whatever they did could give rise to their arrest and punishment. The humiliation and loss of dignity due to the imposition of a purported proper Islam by Ansar Dine Hakim. The moral impact caused as a result of the destruction of monuments of religious importance, which, according to the trial judgment findings, had an emotional impact on the Timbuktu's population. The fear and shame experienced by the victims of public punishments in the context of persecution, the loss of schooling and education due to measures imposed on public schools, the long-lasting psychological impact of persecution. Regarding material harm, the Chamber recalls that a consequence of Ansar Dine Hakim's rules and prohibitions was the discontinuation of some jobs and activities, the closure of shops, and the destruction and confiscation of goods. The Chamber finds that women particularly suffered economic damage from the crime of persecution since they drastically reduced their activities outside of the home for fear of being arrested and punished, diminishing their regular trade. Regarding community harm, the Chamber notes that the evidence in the case file contains a wealth of information related to the harm caused to the community of Timbuktu as a whole, which saw its collective identity, structure, and functioning impacted. The Chamber makes findings as to the following kinds of community harm associated with the crime of persecution: the alteration of the social structure of the city of Timbuktu, impacting the community's cultural, religious, and social traditions; the social impact of the closing of public schools; the separation of families and disruption of the transmission of traditions caused by the fleeing population; the destruction of cultural and religious heritage as a religious persecutory measure, which resulted in the loss of collective identity; and the social impact of the gender aspect of religious persecution, especially related to women and girls, being the subject of strict gender-specific rules on clothing and public and private behavior, and the effect on religious groups especially impacted by Ansar Dine Hakim's imposition of their interpretation of Sharia. Regarding the harm suffered by direct victims of the crime of sentencing without due process, the Chamber notes that the trial judgment and sentencing decision made no specific findings on the harm suffered by the direct victims of this crime. However, based on the consistent jurisprudence of regional human rights tribunals, the Chamber presumes that on a balance of probabilities, the Islamic court's lack of essential guarantees of independence and impartiality created an environment that inflicted moral harm on the victims in the form of, inter alia, stigmatization, impact to the honor and reputation of the victim, anxiety, frustration, and a feeling of injustice. As to the harm suffered by direct victims of torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity, the Chamber identifies in the reparations order the detailed physical, moral, and material harm caused to each of the 14 victims of these crimes, and finds that the acknowledgement of the harm experienced by the direct victims in the case serves as a symbolic and satisfaction measure. In relation to the harm suffered by indirect victims, the Chamber finds on a balance of probabilities, family members of the 14 direct victims of the crimes of torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, and outrages on personal dignity suffered moral harm in the form of psychological impact. In addition, the Chamber finds that the witnesses of the punishments imposed against the 14 direct victims suffered moral harm, which may include psychological or emotional harm, trauma resulting from seeing people being publicly flogged or amputated, shock, and fear. The Chamber now turns to the types and modalities of reparations to be awarded. Based on the factors set out in Rule 98.3, the Chamber finds in this case the most appropriate type of reparations to address the harm suffered by the victims for the crimes for which Mr. Alassane was convicted is collective, community-based reparations with a limited, individualized component. The Chamber has reached this conclusion in light of the nature and scope of the harm suffered as a result of the crimes, the number of eligible victims in this case estimated by the Chamber to be approximately 65,202 victims, the need for an efficient and effective delivery of reparations, and the need to do no harm to the population of Timbuktu City. For the victims of crime other than persecution, the Chamber recognized that these victims, as well as other victims of persecution who suffered acts consistent with torture, mutilation, other inhumane acts, cruel treatment, and outrages on personal dignity, who have experienced specific harm, particularly physical and psychological harm, which warrants a more individualized component of the reparations award, and thus the Chamber has so ordered a limited individualized component for those victims. The Chamber carefully considered the parties and participants' submissions on a symbolic or monetary award of some nature. However, the Chamber has found that in the particular circumstances of this case, collective community-based reparations are most fitting to address the different types of harm suffered by the victims while ensuring the efficiency and integrity of the process. Further, the Chamber is convinced that awarding an appropriate and meaningful symbolic award in this case is simply not feasible. The Chamber wishes to make clear that collective community-based reparations refer both to the group that will receive reparations and the mode in which the reparations will be delivered. With respect to the group, the Chamber is referring to the community of eligible victims in this case, that is the population of Timbuktu City present during the temporal scope of the case. Regarding the mode in which reparations are delivered, the Chamber is referring to community-based measures and programs that can reach large numbers of victims in a less resource-intensive manner. The Chamber considers the most appropriate modalities to address the harm, in this case, in an efficient and effective manner, is through collective reparations focused on rehabilitation measures, as well as symbolic and satisfaction measures. Specifically, the Chamber awards rehabilitation measures directed at rectifying the moral, material, and community harm suffered by the victims. The part of this measure, socioeconomic support, should be implemented, especially support for income-gathering activities. The implementation of these types of community-based measures could include cash-based support aimed at assisting victims in restoring economic activity. The Chamber emphasizes that women and girls suffered particular moral and material harm as a result of the crime of persecution, and this should be reflected in the planning, design, and implementation of all socioeconomic rehabilitation projects and initiatives. The Chamber also notes that educational support through programs or trainings should be implemented as a rehabilitation measure, as well as collective, community-based psychological rehabilitation to address the physiological harm suffered by victims as a result of the crimes. In addition, the Chamber awards collective symbolic and satisfaction measures intended to acknowledge the violations of the victims' rights, safeguard their dignity, and promote cohesion, reconciliation, reduction of tension in the community, and commemoration. Finally, the Chamber's detailed recounting of the harm suffered by the victims in the trial judgment, the sentencing decision, and the order serves as a satisfaction measure in the case. As to the limited individualized component previously mentioned, the Chamber awards rehabilitation measures to address the physical and psychological harm suffered by the individual victims of the crimes other than persecution, as well as similarly situated victims of persecution. Turning to the selection of projects and initiatives, the Chamber finds it's most appropriate for the Trust Fund for Victims to design these programs in close consultation with the victims. In this regard, the Chamber endorses the use of a participatory processes that involves the community of Timbuktu to determine which projects and initiatives are the most appropriate and acceptable to the victims. I will now outline the costs, explaining the cost associated with each measure that has been awarded. The details on how the Chamber arrived at these amounts is contained in the reparations order. Regarding the rehabilitation measures, the Chamber estimates that the cost of implementing socioeconomic and educational support programs would amount to 4 million euros. Regarding collective, community-based psychological rehabilitation measures, the Chamber estimates that the cost of implementing this program would amount to 1,200,000 euros. As for the physical and psychological rehabilitation, which constitutes the limited individualized component, the Chamber awards 1,500,000 euros. Finally, regarding symbolic and satisfaction measures, the Chamber awards 550,000 euros. In light of the above, the Chamber considers Mr. Alassane total liability for the harm to victims of the crimes for which he was convicted to amount to a total of 7,250,000 euros, equivalent to 4,755,688,250 CFA francs as of 24 April 2026. The Chamber is satisfied that setting Mr. Alhassan's liability for reparations at this amount is fair, equitable, and appropriate, and takes into account the rights of the victims and those of the convicted person. In the order, the Chamber instructs the Trust Fund for Victims to prepare a draft implementation plan with the details of the rehabilitation and symbolic measures to be included within the collective community-based reparations and limited individualized component. The identification, collection of information, and eligibility assessments will be the responsibility of the registry. Outreach will also be designed and conducted by the registry. The Chamber notes that no property and assets belonging to Mr. Alhassan have been identified to date and requests the Presidency to regularly monitor Mr. Alhassan's financial capacity for the purposes of reparations. Due to Mr. Alhassan's current financial status, the Chamber invites the Trust Funds for Victims Board of Directors to complement the resources to fulfill the reparations award as stipulated in the regulations of the Trust Fund. The Chamber understands that in order for the Trust Fund for Victims to be able to fully complement the award, substantial fundraising will need to take place and takes the opportunity to encourage states, organizations, corporations, and private individuals to support the Trust Fund's mission and efforts and contribute to its fundraising activities. Je vais maintenant parler en français. La Chambre souhaiterait s'adresser à celles et ceux qui ont subi des préjudices en raison du régime imposé par un Sardin acmis à Tombouctou, mais qui ne remplissent pas les critères afin d'être considérés comme des victimes de crimes autres que persécution. La Chambre souhaite, une fois de plus, reconnaître la réalité de votre souffrance et vous exprimer toute sa compassion, notamment en ce qui concerne les femmes et les filles qui ont particulièrement souffert. La Chambre tient également à exprimer son espoir sincère que les réparations collectives qu'elle a ordonnées seront réparées dans une certaine mesure. Les préjudices que vous avez subis de manière concrète, prompte et effective. Maintenant, je vais reprendre en anglais. For the foregoing reasons, the Chamber hereby unanimously adopts the following substantive dispositions. Other also unanimously adopted procedural dispositions can be found in the reparations order. The Chamber issues an order for reparations against Mr. Al-Hassan, awards collective community-based reparations with a limited individualized component focused on rehabilitation, symbolic and satisfaction measures to the direct and indirect eligible victims in the case. Assesses Mr. Al-Hassan's liability for reparations at approximately €7,250,000, equivalent to $4,755,688,250 CFA francs. Decides that any payments by Mr. Al-Hassan must be counted towards the reparations order against him and shall not be classified as a voluntary contributions or a symbolic form of reparations. Invites the Trust Fund for Victims to complement the resources to fulfill the reparations award and to engage in additional fundraising efforts to the extent necessary to meet the totality of the award. Instructs the Trust Fund to prepare a draft implementation plan pursuant to the requirements outlined in the present order and to submit it for the Chamber's approval by 25 January 2027 at the latest. Instructs the Registry to design and conduct throughout the duration of the administrative eligibility process the required outreach campaign for the purposes of this reparations proceeding, after engaging in consultation with the parties, the Trust Fund for Victims, the VPRS, and OPCV. Instructs to the Registry to commence with the identification of potential beneficiaries as soon as possible and prior to the approval of the draft implementation plan. Requests that the Presidency, with the support of the Registry, continues to explore whether Mr. Al-Hassan possesses any undiscovered assets and to monitor his financial situation on an ongoing basis, and encourages, again, states, organizations, corporations, private individuals to support the Trust Fund's mission and efforts and contribute to its activities. This concludes the Chamber's summary and today's hearing. As I said, the written reparations order with the Chamber's findings and conclusions, which remains the only authoritative document, has been issued, and you will see it shortly. The Chamber wishes to thank the interpreters, the court reporters, security, and all other Registry staff for facilitating this hearing. We would also like to thank all of those who have attended the hearing today, those in the public gallery, and those following online, especially the members of the community of Timbuktu, and more generally, the people of Mali. This hearing is adjourned.
All rise, we will obey.